The unmarked police cars rolled up Berkshire Drive just after dawn on March 14, 2024, their presence shattering the quiet routine of a typical Thursday morning in the Donaldson neighborhood of Nashville. Detectives from the Metro Nashville Police Department's cold case unit stepped out onto the damp pavement, their breath visible in the cool early spring air, and approached a modest brick ranch house that looked like every other home on the tree-lined street. The lawn was neatly maintained, a basketball hoop stood in the driveway, and a minivan sat parked near the garage. It was the kind of house where families barbecued on weekends and kids rode bikes in circles until the streetlights came on. Nothing about it suggested darkness or secrets or violence, but the person who answered the door that morning, a 52-year-old man who'd lived in this neighborhood for nearly a decade, was about to learn that the past doesn't stay buried forever, that evidence preserved with care can speak across decades, and that justice, even when delayed by 20 years, eventually finds its way to your front door. As the lead detective identified himself and his team, as he spoke the words that would change everything, the man's face shifted through a sequence of emotions that witnesses would later describe as shock, confusion, and finally, a terrible resignation. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and neighbors began emerging from their homes, coffee mugs in hand, trying to understand why police were arresting the friendly guy from 3 houses down. But the detectives weren't thinking about the present moment or the suburban scene unfolding around them. They were thinking about another morning, another discovery, 21 years earlier, when a young woman's body had been found in circumstances so brutal and mysterious that the case had haunted Nashville for more than 2 decades. The question that had tormented investigators and a grieving family for all those years was finally about to be answered. How did a killer live a normal life for 21 years while a family suffered without answers? Before we dive into this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us bring these forgotten cases back into the light. The call had come into Nashville's emergency dispatch just after 7 in the morning on November 9, 2003, a Sunday. The voice on the other end belonged to a maintenance worker at the Harmony Ridge apartment complex off Briley Parkway, a sprawling collection of 2-story buildings that housed young professionals, college students, and working families trying to make it in Music City. He'd been doing his routine checks when he noticed that apartment 24B had its door slightly ajar, which was unusual for that early on a Sunday morning when most residents were still sleeping off Saturday night or getting ready for church. He'd knocked, called out, and when no one answered, he'd pushed the door open wider. What he saw in the next moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. Within 15 minutes, Briley Parkway was lit up with emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an overnight rain. Yellow crime scene tape went up quickly, cordoning off the entire building, and residents began gathering in clusters, some still in pajamas and robes, all of them trying to understand what had happened to their neighbor. Detective Marcus Webb arrived on scene at 7:45. A veteran homicide investigator with Metro Nashville PD, who'd worked hundreds of cases during his 15-year career. But even with all his experience, even with all the terrible things he'd seen, the scene in apartment 240B hit him hard. Sarah Michelle Hendricks lay on the floor of her small living room, positioned in a way that suggested violence and struggle. She was 26 years old, dressed in the jeans and green sweater she'd been wearing the night before when she'd gone out with friends. There was no sign of forced entry at the front door, which meant she'd likely let her attacker inside or they'd had a key. The apartment showed signs of a struggle. Furniture slightly displaced, items knocked from the coffee table, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen counter, wallet inside with cash and credit cards intact. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else, something more personal and more terrifying. The medical examiner would later determine that Sarah had died sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning, strangled in her own home while most of the apartment complex slept. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms where she'd fought back, and the forensic team collected evidence that suggested her attacker had spent time in the apartment both before and after her death. But in those early hours of the investigation, as detectives canvassed neighbors and tried to piece together Sarah's final hours, the most pressing question was simple and devastating. Who did this, and why? Sarah Michelle Hendricks had grown up in Franklin, Tennessee, a picturesque town about 20 miles south of Nashville, known for its historic downtown and Civil War battlefield. She was the youngest of three children, born to parents who'd both worked as teachers in the Williamson County school system. Her mother taught second grade, and her father coached high school baseball while teaching history. Sarah had been the baby of the family, arriving 6 years after her next oldest sibling, and her parents often joked that she'd been their surprise blessing, the child they hadn't planned but couldn't imagine life without. Friends from her childhood remembered Sarah as naturally outgoing, the kind of kid who made friends easily and genuinely cared about people's feelings. She played soccer through high school, not because she was particularly athletic, but because she loved being part of a team, loved the social aspect of sports. She sang in the church choir with a voice that wasn't professional quality but was heartfelt and joyful. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning throughout her teenage years, arriving early to walk dogs and clean cages, often coming home with stories about pets who needed homes, and convincing her parents to foster more animals than their modest house could reasonably accommodate. 8. After graduating from Franklin High School in 1995, Sarah had attended Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, where she'd studied communications with dreams of working in Nashville's music industry. Not as a performer, she'd tell people, because she knew her talents lay elsewhere, but maybe in artist management or publicity, something that would let her be part of the creative energy that made Nashville special. She'd worked part-time jobs throughout college, waited tables at a barbecue restaurant, answered phones at a recording studio, always hustling and networking and trying to build connections that might lead to her dream career. She'd graduated in 1999 and moved to Nashville proper, landing an entry-level position at a small publicity firm that represented up-and-coming country artists. The pay was terrible, and the hours were long, but Sarah loved it. She loved being backstage at the Ryman, even if she was just there to hand out press credentials. She loved writing press releases about artists most people had never heard of, but who might be the next big thing. She loved the hustle and the hope that defined Nashville's music scene, the way talented people from small towns across America came here chasing dreams that sometimes, against all odds, actually came true. By 2003, Sarah had worked her way up to a junior account manager position. She had her own small roster of clients, mostly unsigned artists or indie label acts, and she was building a reputation as someone reliable and creative. Her boss would later tell detectives that Sarah had real potential, that she was the kind of employee who stayed late to get things done right, who treated every client like they mattered regardless of their chart position. Colleagues described her as the person who remembered your birthday, who organized happy hours to celebrate small victories, who checked in when you seemed down. Sarah's personal life in 2003 was typical for a 26-year-old woman finding her footing in a big city. She'd had a serious boyfriend through most of college, but they'd broken up after graduation when he'd moved to Atlanta for a job, and long distance proved too difficult. Since then, she'd dated casually, gone out with friends to Broadway's honky-tonks, attended concerts and festivals, lived the life of a young professional in Music City. She rented the apartment at Harmony Ridge because it was affordable and close to her office, because several coworkers lived in the same complex, because it had a pool where she could swim laps in the summer, and a small gym where she tried to work out a few times a week. Her parents had talked to her by phone that Saturday afternoon, November 8th, just hours before she died. It had been a normal conversation, the kind of weekly check-in that happens in families where parents and adult children stay connected. Sarah had told them about work, about a new client she was excited about plans to come home to Franklin for Thanksgiving in a few weeks. Her mother would later say that Sarah sounded happy, maybe a little tired from a busy week, but nothing concerning, nothing that suggested fear or trouble. They'd ended the call with, "I love you," like they always did, never knowing those would be the last words they'd exchange. That Saturday night, Sarah had gone out with 3 friends from work, a group of women who'd gotten into the habit of hitting Lower Broadway most weekends. They'd gone to dinner at a Mexican restaurant on Division Street, then walked down to Broadway around 9 o'clock to catch live music at a few different venues. Security camera footage from various bars would later show Sarah laughing with her friends, drinking but not heavily, dancing to cover bands playing Garth Brooks and Patsy Cline. She'd been wearing that green sweater and jeans, her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking relaxed and happy, just another young woman enjoying a Saturday night in Nashville. Around 11:30, Sarah had told her friends she was heading home. She had an early morning yoga class on Sunday that she tried never to miss, and she'd reached that point in the night where continuing to party seemed less appealing than getting decent sleep. Her friends had offered to share a cab with her since they were all heading to the same general area, but Sarah had said she'd be fine. She'd catch her own ride. Security footage from outside Tootsie's Orchid Lounge showed her walking toward the street, presumably to find a taxi or call for a ride. After that, she disappeared into the Nashville night, and the next confirmed sighting of Sarah Hendricks would be the maintenance worker finding her body 12 hours later. Detective Webb's investigation moved quickly in those first crucial hours and days. He and his team interviewed Sarah's friends, who were devastated and struggling to understand what had happened. They all said the same thing, that Sarah had seemed completely normal that night, happy even, showing no signs of being scared or followed or troubled. None of them could think of anyone who'd want to hurt her. She didn't have enemies or stalkers or angry ex-boyfriends making threats. She was just Sarah, kind and funny and hard-working. The last person who deserved something like this. The forensic team processed Department 214B with meticulous care, photographing everything, collecting trace evidence, dusting for fingerprints, swabbing for DNA. They found biological evidence that would prove crucial. Samples that clearly belonged to someone other than Sarah. Evidence of her attacker's presence that got carefully logged and preserved in the evidence room at Metro headquarters. In 2003, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, but the databases were still relatively small, and the sophisticated techniques that would revolutionize cold case investigation 2 decades later were still in development. They ran the DNA through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but got no hits. Whoever had killed Sarah wasn't in the system. Detective Webb developed a list of persons of interest, people who knew Sarah or had been in her orbit that Saturday night. There was a guy she dated briefly a few months earlier, but he had an airtight alibi, was out of town that entire weekend at his brother's wedding in Memphis with dozens of witnesses. There was a client at her publicity firm who'd been perhaps too friendly, whose attention had made Sarah slightly uncomfortable, according to one coworker, but investigation showed he'd been at a recording session in a studio with multiple witnesses until 4 in the morning. There was a neighbor in the apartment complex who'd asked Sarah out and been politely rejected, but he'd been visiting family in Knoxville that weekend. Every lead that initially seemed promising eventually hit a wall. Every suspect got cleared through alibis or forensic evidence that didn't match. Weeks became months, and despite hundreds of hours of investigation, despite reviewing security footage from every camera along Sarah's potential routes home that night, despite interviewing anyone who might have seen something, the case grew cold. Detective Webb felt it slipping away, felt that terrible frustration that comes when you know someone committed murder and you can't prove who. The file got thicker with reports and interviews and dead-end leads, but no closer to an arrest. Sarah's parents called every week asking for updates, and Webb had to tell them variations of the same heartbreaking truth. They were still working it, still pursuing angles, but they didn't have enough to charge anyone yet. By the first anniversary of Sarah's death in November 2004, the investigation had effectively stalled. Webb still reviewed the file regularly, still hoped for a break, but new cases kept coming and demanding attention and resources. By the second anniversary, the case was functionally cold, though officially it remained open and active. Sarah's murder joined the unfortunate collection of unsolved homicides in Nashville, a statistic in a database, a file box in an evidence room, a family's unending nightmare. But Detective Marcus Webb did something that would prove crucial 20 years later. He made sure every piece of evidence was properly stored and preserved. He documented everything meticulously. He submitted evidence for DNA analysis multiple times as new testing methods became available. He kept the case alive in ways both official and personal, believing that someday, somehow, Sarah Hendricks would get justice. He just had to wait for the technology to catch up to the truth. The years after Sarah Hendricks' murder passed with a cruel normalcy for everyone except the people who loved her. In Franklin, her parents marked time by the calendar of their daughter's absence. November 9th became a day of private mourning, a date circled in permanent marker on their hearts. The first anniversary in 2004 brought local news coverage, a brief segment showing Sarah's photo and asking anyone with information to come forward. Her mother and father stood in their living room, surrounded by reporters, and gave emotional pleas for justice, for answers, for someone to do the right thing and speak up if they knew anything. The phones at Metro Nashville police rang for a few days afterward with tips that all led nowhere. People who thought they'd seen something or heard something but whose information couldn't move the investigation forward. By the fifth anniversary in 2008, the media attention had dwindled to a single paragraph in the Tennessean's Crime Roundup, a brief mention that Sarah's case remained unsolved and that investigators still welcomed tips. Her parents held a small memorial service at their church in Franklin, the same sanctuary where Sarah had sung in the choir as a teenager, where her funeral had been held 5 years earlier. Friends and family gathered, maybe 30 people, far fewer than the hundreds who'd attended her funeral when grief was fresh and the community was still reeling. They lit candles and shared memories and prayed for justice that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. Sarah's oldest sister Jennifer had struggled the most with the lack of closure. She'd been 32 when Sarah died, married with 2 young children, living a stable life in Brentwood working as a pediatric nurse. But Sarah's murder had fractured something fundamental in Jennifer's sense of safety and order. How could someone kill her baby sister and just walk away? How could a person commit such evil and then go about their normal life, maybe getting coffee at Starbucks or mowing their lawn or taking their own kids to soccer practice while Sarah was gone forever? Jennifer became obsessed with true crime, spending hours watching Investigation Discovery, reading books about forensic science, following online forums where amateur sleuths discussed cold cases. Her husband worried about her, suggested therapy, gently pointed out that she was neglecting her own life and mental health in pursuit of answers she couldn't find. But Jennifer couldn't let go. She learned the names of every detective who'd worked Sarah's case, called them periodically with theories and questions, checked in to make sure they hadn't forgotten about her sister. Sarah's father, Thomas, developed a different kind of grief ritual. He'd been a baseball coach for 23 years, known for his patience and his ability to connect with struggling players. But after Sarah's death, he couldn't find the same joy in the game. He finished out that 2003 season because he didn't want to abandon his team mid-year, but he didn't return the following spring. Instead, he became an advocate for victims' families, connecting with other parents whose children had been murdered, attending support group meetings, testifying before the Tennessee legislature about the need for more resources for cold case units. He became friendly with several detectives in Metro Nashville's cold case unit, which had been formally established in 2006, partly in response to advocacy from families like his. Thomas understood that detectives were doing their best with limited resources, that Sarah's case was one of many, that new murders kept happening and demanded immediate attention. But he made sure the detectives knew that his family was still waiting, still hoping, still believing that someday technology or luck or persistence would crack the case. Detective Marcus Webb retired from Metro Nashville Police in 2015 after 30 years on the force, but Sarah Hendricks' case went with him in ways that retirement couldn't erase. He'd worked hundreds of homicides during his career, solved most of them, but the unsolved ones haunted him in a way the closed cases didn't. Sarah's face was one of several that appeared in his dreams sometimes, young people whose killers he'd never identified, whose families had trusted him to deliver justice he couldn't provide. Webb had done everything right by the book. He preserved evidence meticulously, had been ahead of the curve in understanding that DNA technology would improve and that samples needed to be stored properly for future analysis. He'd resubmitted evidence multiple times over the years as new testing methods became available. First in 2007 when more sensitive DNA amplification techniques emerged, again in 2012 when touch DNA analysis became more reliable. Each time they confirmed the presence of unknown male DNA from the crime scene, but running it through CODIS produced no matches. The killer simply wasn't in any database. In retirement, Webb stayed in touch with the cold case unit, calling periodically to check on various cases including Sarah's. He attended the 15th anniversary memorial in 2018, standing quietly in the back of the Franklin Church, while Thomas and his wife spoke about keeping hope alive. Webb introduced himself to the family afterward, told them he'd been the original lead detective, promised them he'd never stop thinking about Sarah. Thomas gripped Webb's hand with both of his own and said something the detective would never forget. He said he didn't blame Webb or any of the investigators, that he understood they'd done everything possible with the tools available, but that he was running out of time. Thomas was 71 years old, his wife was 68, and they needed to see justice before they died. They needed to know their daughter's killer had been held accountable. Webb promised he'd keep advocating for the case, keep pushing for new analyses, keep believing that the answer was out there waiting to be found. The technological revolution that would ultimately solve Sarah's case had been building slowly and then suddenly across those 2 decades. In 2003, DNA databases were limited to convicted offenders and arrestees in certain states, maybe a few million profiles total in CODIS. The idea that you could use DNA to identify a criminal through their relatives seemed like science fiction, the kind of thing that might be possible someday but wasn't practical yet. But consumer DNA testing changed everything. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com launched in the mid-2000s, and by the 2010s, millions of Americans were sending in their saliva samples to learn about their ethnic heritage, find distant cousins, and explore their genetic makeup. Most people doing these tests never imagined they were also creating a massive genetic database that law enforcement might someday access. The breakthrough that proved genetic genealogy could solve cold cases came in April 2018 with the arrest of Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, who'd terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s. Investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, identified distant relatives of the killer, built out family trees, and narrowed their suspect pool until they landed on DeAngelo. He was arrested at age 72, more than 30 years after his last known crime, because DNA technology had finally caught up to evidence that had been waiting patiently in evidence rooms for decades. The case made international headlines and sparked a revolution in cold case investigation. Metro Nashville's cold case unit was paying attention. Detective Andrea Martinez, who joined the unit in 2017 and inherited several unsolved cases, including Sarah Hendricks, had been following the genetic genealogy developments with growing excitement. She'd attended conferences where forensic genealogists explained their methods, learned about other cases being solved through this approach, and became convinced that Nashville's cold cases might finally get the justice they deserved. But genetic genealogy wasn't cheap, and police budgets were tight, and there was a backlog of cases all competing for limited resources. Martinez had to prioritize, had to decide which cases had the best preserved DNA evidence and the highest likelihood of success. Sarah Hendricks' case was near the top of her list. The DNA evidence was solid, well preserved, thanks to Detective Webb's foresight, and the sample quality was good enough for the kind of analysis genetic genealogy required. In March 2023, exactly 20 years after Webb had first submitted Sarah's case DNA to CODIS with no results, Martinez got approval to send the evidence to Othram, a private lab in Texas specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The cost was substantial, nearly $10,000. But Thomas and his wife had contributed to a victims advocacy fund that helped cover costs for cases like this, and the department allocated additional resources. The DNA sample was packaged carefully and shipped to Texas, and Martinez began the waiting game. The forensic genealogists at Othram worked with remarkable precision and patience. They extracted what they could from the 20-year-old DNA sample, processed it through advanced sequencing technology that hadn't existed when Sarah was killed, and uploaded the genetic profile to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, public databases where users had agreed to allow law enforcement access. Within weeks, they had hits, distant genetic relatives of whoever had left DNA at Sarah's crime scene. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings or even first cousins, but third cousins and fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor several generations back. To most people, these distant relatives would be strangers, names on a family tree they'd never met and probably never heard of. But to forensic genealogists, they were road maps. The genealogist assigned to Sarah's case, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd worked on dozens of successful cold case identifications, began the painstaking process of building family trees. She started with the genetic matches and worked backward, identifying their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, tracing lineages through census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses and obituaries. She was looking for the common ancestor, the person from whom both the genetic matches and the unknown killer descended. Once she found those common ancestors, usually someone born in the 1800s or early 1900s, she could work forward through all the descendants, building out every branch of the family tree to identify everyone alive today who might be related. This process took months of meticulous research. Patricia worked through public records and genealogy websites, documented every connection, verified every relationship. By July 2023, she'd built a tree with thousands of individuals, but she'd also narrowed the suspect pool considerably. Based on the genetic distance of the matches, The killer was likely a man born somewhere between 1965 and 1980, descended from a particular set of great-great-grandparents who'd lived in Tennessee in the late 1800s. Patricia provided Detective Martinez with a list of approximately 47 men who fit the genetic profile and the general demographic parameters. Now it was up to the detective to narrow further. Martinez spent the next several months working the list. She started eliminating possibilities based on basic criteria: too old or too young in 2003 to match the investigative profile, living in another state or country in November 2003 with no plausible connection to Nashville, deceased before Sarah's murder, incarcerated during the time frame. Female relatives who'd been flagged by error. The list shrank steadily. She cross-referenced names with the original investigation, looking for anyone who'd been interviewed or mentioned in witness statements or appeared in Sarah's life in any documented way. She obtained recent photos where possible, comparing them to security footage from that night in 2003, looking for potential physical matches. By December 2023, Martinez had narrowed the list to 5 men who couldn't be easily eliminated. Each of them became the subject of intense investigation. She researched their lives, their histories, their connections to Nashville in 2003. She looked for criminal records, employment histories, DMV records, anything that might place them in proximity to Sarah or the crime scene. She consulted with the original investigators, showed them photos, asked if any of the names or faces triggered memories from the investigation. And slowly, one name began standing out from the others, one man whose profile seemed to fit in ways that made Martinez's instincts tingle. His name was Brian Keith Morrison, and in 2003 he'd been 31 years old, living in Nashville, working as a contractor doing renovation work on various properties around the city. He'd had no criminal record at the time, nothing that would put him in any database, nothing that would make him stand out to investigators. But when Martinez dug into his background, patterns emerged that were troubling. He'd been questioned in connection with an assault on a woman in 1999, but never charged. He'd been fired from a job in 2001 after female coworkers complained about his behavior, though nothing criminal came of it. He'd moved around frequently, different apartments and houses across Nashville, a transient pattern that could be innocent or could suggest someone avoiding scrutiny. And in early 2004, just months after Sarah's murder, he left Nashville entirely, moved to a different state, started over somewhere new. Martinez obtained Morrison's current address through DMV records. He was now 52 years old, living in suburban Nashville, had moved back to Tennessee in 2015 after years in Georgia. He'd married, had children, worked as a construction project manager, appeared to be living a completely normal middle-class life. On paper and from the outside, he looked like any other suburban dad, someone whose neighbors probably considered him friendly and unremarkable. But Martinez knew that appearances could be deceiving, that evil didn't always look like what people expected, that the scariest monsters were often the ones who blended in seamlessly. The final step was obtaining a direct DNA sample from Morrison to confirm the match. Martinez couldn't just knock on his door and ask for a cheek swab without alerting him and potentially giving him opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Instead, she used a common investigative technique called trash pull. In February 2024, detectives obtained discarded items from Morrison's garbage, materials he'd thrown away that legally became public property once placed at the curb. They recovered a water bottle and some tissues, items that might contain his DNA, and sent them to the lab for analysis. The results came back in early March 2024, and they were definitive. The DNA from Brian Morrison's discarded items matched the DNA from Sarah Hendricks' crime scene. After 21 years, they'd found him. The man who'd killed Sarah and walked free for more than 2 decades, who'd lived a normal life while a family grieved, who probably never expected to be caught after so much time had passed. Detective Martinez called Thomas Hendricks on March 12th to tell him what he'd been waiting 21 years to hear. They'd identified Sarah's killer, and an arrest warrant was being prepared. Thomas wept on the phone, called his wife to share the news, called Jennifer, who'd never stopped searching for answers. The nightmare wasn't over, but finally, there was movement toward justice. Brian Keith Morrison's life in March 2024 appeared, from every external indicator, to be stable and unremarkable. He lived with his wife of 12 years and their 2 teenage children in that brick ranch house on Berkshire Drive, a quiet street in Donaldson where neighbors knew each other's names and kids played basketball in driveways until dinner time. He'd worked for the same construction management company for 8 years, overseeing renovation projects across Nashville, earning a solid middle-class income that allowed for modest vacations and college savings accounts. His coworkers would later tell reporters that Brian was competent and professional, maybe a bit reserved, but not in a way that seemed odd, just someone who did his job well and didn't share much about his personal life. His neighbors considered him friendly enough, the kind of guy who waved when you drove past, who kept his property maintained, who didn't cause problems or drama. On Sunday mornings, his family loaded into their minivan and drove to a Baptist church in Hermitage where they'd been members for 6 years. To anyone observing from the outside, the Morrisons looked like a normal American family living a normal American life. But Detective Andrea Martinez knew what the neighbors and coworkers and church members didn't know. She knew that Brian Morrison's DNA matched evidence from a brutal murder scene 21 years earlier. She knew that in November 2003, when he was 31 years old and working as an independent contractor in Nashville, he'd somehow crossed paths with Sarah Hendricks and ended her life in her own apartment. Martinez had spent weeks after the DNA confirmation building a more complete picture of Morrison's history, and what she'd found painted a darker portrait than his current suburban existence suggested. In 2003, Morrison had been single, living alone in a small apartment in Antioch, working various renovation jobs that took him to properties all over Davidson County. He'd had a string of short-term relationships that seemed to end badly, though none of the women he dated had filed police reports or restraining orders. He'd been questioned about an incident in 1919 when a woman he'd briefly dated reported feeling threatened by him, said he'd shown up at her workplace uninvited and wouldn't leave when asked. But no charges were filed, and the woman eventually moved out of state. What Martinez found most significant was Morrison's pattern of movement in the months following Sarah's murder. In January 2004, just 2 months after Sarah died, Morrison had abruptly left Nashville. He'd broken his apartment lease, left no forwarding address, and moved to Augusta, Georgia, where he had a cousin who helped him find work. He'd stayed in Georgia for 11 years, working construction, eventually marrying a woman he'd met at a church social in 2009. They'd had 2 children, and by all accounts, Morrison had been a decent husband and father, at least on the surface. No domestic violence reports, no obvious red flags. In 2015, when a major construction firm offered him a management position, Morrison and his family had moved back to Tennessee, settling in Donaldson. He'd been back in Nashville for 9 years, living just miles from where Sarah Hendricks had been killed, probably driving past the Harmony Ridge apartment complex occasionally without a second thought, believing he'd gotten away with murder. The arrest warrant for Brian Keith Morrison was signed by a Davidson County judge on March 13, 2024, charging him with first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Michelle Hendricks. The warrant laid out the evidence in clinical legal language: the genetic genealogy investigation, the DNA match, the probable cause for arrest. Detective Martinez coordinated with patrol units and planned the arrest for early morning on March 14th, wanting to take Morrison into custody before he left for work, minimizing the chance of a confrontation or flight attempt. She worked cold case arrests before and knew they could be unpredictable. Sometimes suspects broke down immediately, relieved in a strange way that the secret they'd carried for years was finally exposed. Other times they denied everything, insisted there must be a mistake, demanded lawyers, and refused to speak. Martinez didn't know which category Morrison would fall into, but she was prepared for either. That Thursday morning, when detectives approached Morrison's front door, his wife had already left to drop their kids at school before heading to her job as an office manager at a dental practice. Morrison answered the door in jeans and a work shirt, clearly preparing to leave for a job site, and his expression when Detective Martinez identified herself and informed him he was under arrest for the 2003 murder of Sarah Hendricks was one Martinez would remember for a long time. It wasn't shock exactly, and it wasn't the confusion of an innocent person wrongly accused. It was something closer to resignation, a flash of recognition that his past had finally caught up to him, followed quickly by a careful blankness as Morrison shut down emotionally and verbally. He said nothing as Martinez read him his rights, nothing as handcuffs were placed on his wrists, nothing as he was led to an unmarked car, while neighbors emerged from their houses to witness the scene. The search of Morrison's home that followed his arrest yielded computers, phones, and various personal items that would be analyzed for any evidence connecting him to Sarah or providing insight into his activities in 2003. Investigators weren't expecting to find souvenirs or trophies from the crime. 21 years was a long time, and Morrison had moved multiple times, but they had to be thorough. What they did find was a life that looked disappointingly normal. Family photos on the walls, kids' artwork on the refrigerator, a modest home office with files related to construction projects. If darkness lived in Brian Morrison, it wasn't visible in the physical trappings of his domestic life. Morrison's wife returned home around 10 that morning to find police vehicles in her driveway and detectives searching her house. The confusion and horror on her face was genuine, and investigators felt sympathy for her even as they had to treat her as a potential source of information. She insisted she knew nothing about any crime from 2003, that Brian had never mentioned anything about being questioned by police or having any trouble in his past. She met him in Georgia in 2009, 6 years after Sarah's murder, and by then Brian had been working steadily and presenting himself as a stable, decent man looking for a relationship. She'd had no reason to suspect he was hiding something terrible. Now she was learning that her husband of 12 years, the father of her children, was accused of murder, and her entire world was collapsing in real time. Detectives gave her a card with victim services resources, knowing that she and her children were victims too, in a different way, their lives irrevocably damaged by Brian Morrison's choices. The news of Morrison's arrest exploded across Nashville media within hours. Local television stations broke into regular programming with updates, showing footage of Morrison being led into the Criminal Justice Center in downtown Nashville. The Tennessean published a detailed article about the arrest, explaining the genetic genealogy investigation and connecting Morrison to the cold case that had haunted the city for 2 decades. Social media platforms lit up with reactions from people who remembered Sarah's case, from true crime enthusiasts who'd followed cold case developments, from residents of Donaldson shocked to learn they'd been living near an accused murderer. The story had everything that made for compelling coverage: a victim who'd been young and innocent, a case gone cold for 21 years, cutting-edge forensic technology, and a suspect hiding in plain sight. Metro Nashville police held a press conference that afternoon in the lobby of the Criminal Justice Center, the same space where countless other major cases had been announced over the years. Chief John Drake stood at a podium flanked by Detective Martinez, cold case unit supervisors, and representatives from the district attorney's office. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and members of Sarah's family who'd driven up from Franklin to be present for this moment. Chief Drake spoke first, outlining the basics of the case, praising the persistence of investigators across 2 decades, and thanking the Hendricks family for never giving up hope. He explained how genetic genealogy had identified Morrison as a suspect, and how traditional detective work had confirmed the match, emphasizing that this arrest represented the power of combining new technology with old-fashioned police work. Detective Martinez spoke next, her voice steady but emotional, as she described the investigation. She credited Detective Webb, who was present in the audience, for his meticulous evidence preservation that made this arrest possible 21 years later. She explained that without Webb's foresight in properly storing and documenting DNA evidence, without his repeated submissions for testing as technology advanced, Morrison might never have been identified. She talked about the months of genealogical research, the careful process of building family trees and eliminating suspects, the moment when Morrison's name emerged as the most viable match. And she looked directly at the cameras and said something that resonated across the true crime community and law enforcement circles. She said that this case proved that cold doesn't mean forgotten, that evidence doesn't have an expiration date, and that people who commit murder should never feel safe no matter how much time passes. The assistant district attorney announced that Morrison was being charged with first-degree murder and would be held without bond pending arraignment. The evidence, he said, was strong and scientific, and the state was confident in securing a conviction. He acknowledged that bringing a 21-year-old case to trial would present challenges, memories fade, and witnesses move or die. But DNA evidence doesn't forget, and Morrison's genetic profile was irrefutable proof of his presence at a murder scene. The prosecution team was already preparing for what would likely be a high-profile trial, possibly later in 2024 or early 2025, depending on court schedules and defense motions. Then Thomas Hendricks approached the podium, his wife beside him, and the room fell completely silent. Thomas was 77 years old now, his hair white, his face lined with the kind of grief that never fully heals but becomes a permanent part of your landscape. He held a framed photograph of Sarah, a picture from her college graduation where she was smiling widely in her cap and gown, her whole future ahead of her. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he held the frame up for cameras, making sure everyone could see his daughter's face, could remember that this case was about a real person who'd been loved and lost. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, but also shot through with something that sounded like relief, like a weight being partially lifted after 21 years of carrying it alone. He talked about Sarah, about who she'd been before she became a murder victim and a cold case file number. He described her laugh, her kindness to animals, her dreams of working in the music industry, her habit of calling home every Sunday to check on her parents. He talked about the years of not knowing, of lying awake nights wondering if her killer was still in Nashville, if he walked past them at the grocery store or sat behind them at a Predators game, if he thought about what he'd done or had compartmentalized it completely. Thomas said that nothing could bring Sarah back, that no arrest or conviction or prison sentence could fill the hole her death had left in their family. Their daughter should be 47 years old now, should have had a career and maybe a family of her own, should have been planning what to bring to Thanksgiving dinner next week. Instead, she'd been gone for 21 years, frozen forever at 26. But Thomas also expressed gratitude that felt sincere despite the tragedy. He thanked Detective Webb and Detective Martinez and everyone who'd worked Sarah's case over the years. He thanked the forensic genealogist who'd identified Morrison through science and patience. He thanked the advocacy groups and other victims' families who'd pushed for funding and resources for cold case investigations. And he thanked the technology itself, the DNA databases and genealogy websites that had given law enforcement tools to solve cases that would have remained mysteries forever in earlier eras. Thomas said he hoped Sarah's case would give hope to other families waiting for answers, would prove that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. His wife added that they could finally begin a different kind of healing, that knowing who killed their daughter and seeing him held accountable would allow them to honor Sarah's memory without the open wound of uncertainty. The community reaction to Morrison's arrest was complex and layered. In Donaldson, neighbors struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the charges he faced. Several people interviewed by local news expressed shock and disbelief, saying Brian had seemed like a regular guy, a good father, someone who kept to himself but wasn't creepy or concerning. Others admitted they'd never really known him well, that he'd been friendly on a surface level, but hadn't formed deep connections with people on the street. Morrison's church issued a brief statement expressing shock at the allegations and offering prayers for all involved, including both the Hendricks family and Morrison's wife and children who were innocent victims of his alleged crimes. The construction company where Morrison worked released a statement saying he'd been terminated immediately and that they'd had no knowledge of his past or any criminal history. Online true crime communities erupted with discussions about the case. Amateur sleuths analyzing every detail released by police, debating whether Morrison had committed other crimes that might now be investigated, and celebrating genetic genealogy as a tool for justice. Some privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes, arguing that people who'd submitted DNA to learn about their ancestry hadn't consented to helping police investigations. But most commentary focused on Sarah and the breakthrough that gave her family answers they'd waited more than 2 decades to receive. Morrison's arraignment occurred 3 days after his arrest, a brief court appearance where he stood before a judge in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his expression carefully neutral. He entered a plea of not guilty through his court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Marcus Thompson, who'd been assigned to the case. The judge ordered Morrison held without bond, citing the severity of the charges, the strength of the evidence, and the fact that Morrison had left Nashville shortly after the murder, suggesting flight risk. Morrison showed no visible reaction to the bond decision, simply nodded slightly and was led back out of the courtroom by sheriff's deputies. His wife and children were not present, and Thompson told reporters afterward that the family was devastated and requesting privacy as they tried to process the situation. The legal process ahead would be lengthy and complex. Morrison's defense team would certainly challenge the genetic genealogy evidence, though courts across the country had consistently upheld this investigative technique when properly conducted. They might argue that DNA presence didn't prove murder, that Morrison could have been in Sarah's apartment for innocent reasons, but that argument would be difficult to sustain, given Morrison's lack of any documented connection to Sarah and his abrupt departure from Nashville after her death. The prosecution had time on their side in one sense. DNA doesn't lie, and science would be their strongest witness. But they also faced challenges inherent in prosecuting a 2-decade-old case. Witnesses' memories had faded. Some people who'd been interviewed in 2003 were deceased, and physical evidence beyond the DNA was limited. But District Attorney Glenn Funk expressed confidence at a follow-up press conference that justice would be served. The DNA evidence was compelling and sufficient for conviction, even without additional physical evidence or eyewitness testimony. Modern juries understood DNA, accepted its reliability, and prosecutors had successfully tried older cold cases based primarily on genetic evidence. The trial would likely occur in late 2024 or early 2025, and the state would seek the maximum sentence available under Tennessee law for first-degree murder. For Sarah's family, the arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter in their long journey toward closure. Jennifer, Sarah's sister who'd spent 21 years obsessed with finding answers, finally felt like she could breathe. She told reporters that she'd known this day would come eventually, that she'd believed in her bones that science would catch up to Sarah's killer, but actually seeing it happen felt surreal and overwhelming. She said she'd cry for hours after learning about the arrest, releasing 2 decades of pent-up grief and frustration and hope. She looked forward to attending Morrison's trial, to looking him in the eye, to hearing a jury declare him guilty, to knowing that Sarah's death had been answered with accountability. The case became a teaching moment for law enforcement agencies across the country about the importance of evidence preservation and the potential of genetic genealogy. Metro Nashville's cold case unit received inquiries from other departments wanting to learn about their process, and Detective Martinez became something of a spokesperson for this investigative approach. She gave interviews emphasizing that hundreds of cases could potentially be solved using these techniques if evidence had been properly stored, if funding was available, and if investigators were willing to invest the time required for genealogical research. She estimated that Nashville had at least 24 other cold cases with preserved DNA evidence that could potentially be worked using genetic genealogy, and the success of Sarah's case would likely lead to increased funding and resources for those investigations. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know. If this story moved you, there are dozens of other cases on this channel where justice took years but finally arrived, where families never stopped fighting for answers, where science gave voice to victims who'd been silenced by violence. Sarah Hendricks was 26 years old when Brian Morrison allegedly took her life in November 2003, but her case became a testament to persistence, to the power of properly preserved evidence, and to the idea that murderers can never truly rest easy, no matter how much time passes. Morrison had lived 11 years thinking he'd escaped justice, had built a new life in Georgia, had returned to Nashville believing his past was safely buried. But DNA doesn't forget, families don't give up, and detectives like Marcus Webb and Andrea Martinez don't let cases die just because years pass without breaks. Sarah fought back that terrible night in her apartment, leaving evidence beneath her fingernails and on her clothing that would eventually speak for her 2 decades later. She has the last word now, delivered through chromosomes and genealogy and science that didn't exist when she died, but evolved just in time to expose the man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. Justice for Sarah Hendricks arrived 21 years late, but it arrived, and her family can finally begin to heal, knowing that the person who stole their daughter's future will spend the rest of his life paying for that choice. Time tells all truths eventually, and evidence waits patiently in storage rooms and databases for technology to catch up, for investigators to ask the right questions, for justice to find its way home.